Millionaire fell into a coma and, upon waking up, was shocked to see an immigrant cleaning girl. The room was suffocating with tension, a stark contrast to the sprawling view of New York City visible through the glass walls. At the head of the sleek, polished table sat John Hargrove, a man who radiated power. With his signature tailored suit, perfect gray-streaked hair, and piercing eyes, John was the image of a self-made billionaire. Yet, as he leaned forward to close the deal of his career, his chest tightened. "This is the future of Hargrove Enterprises," John declared, his voice firm but strained. "Either we secure this merger, or we lose everything we've built." The assembled executives nodded solemnly, too intimidated to challenge him. The stakes were high: billions of dollars, hundreds of jobs, and John's unblemished reputation. But John wasn't just fighting for the deal. He was fighting an unseen battle within himself. As the meeting dragged on, a bead of sweat slid down his temple. He ignored it, swallowing another sip of water. He had felt the pressure in his chest all morning, a dull throb he'd chalked up to stress. Yet now it was a vice grip. "Mr. Hargrove," his assistant ventured cautiously, "should we perhaps take a—" "I don't need a break," John barked, slamming his palm on the table. "We finish this now." The room fell silent, the tension almost palpable. But John didn't notice their stares. His world was tilting. The pounding in his ears drowned out the murmurs, and the edges of his vision blurred. Suddenly, John gasped, clutching his chest as pain shot down his left arm. The water glass toppled, shattering as he stumbled back. Gasps erupted from the room. "Call 911, someone shouted. John's knees buckled. His vision darkened. The last thing he saw before collapsing was the city skyline, glowing like embers in the late afternoon sun. The following days were a whirlwind for the business world. News of John Hargrove's heart attack dominated headlines. Billionaire mogul hospitalized after collapse in boardroom. John Hargrove in coma. What's next for his empire? For 2 years the world moved on, but John did not. Trapped in a coma, he lay in a sterile hospital room, oblivious to the empire he had built teetering under new management. The once vibrant mogul, a man of action, now existed in stillness, suspended between life and death. His sprawling penthouse atop a Manhattan skyscraper, once buzzing with meetings and high-profile guests, became a monument to his absence. The towering windows now reflected an empty space, a housekeeper's mop echoing in its cavernous rooms. Miles away, in a modest apartment in Queens, Maria Alvarez clutched a printed flyer with trembling hands. It offered a cleaning position at an exclusive Manhattan residence. The pay was good, better than any other job she could find, and it was her chance to secure her sister's future. "This is it, Mama," Maria whispered in Spanish as she kissed the picture of her late mother on the small altar by her bedside. "I'll make you proud." Maria had crossed the border 2 years ago, leaving behind a life of hardship in Mexico. She carried the weight of her family's survival on her slim shoulders. Every dollar she earned went toward paying for her younger sister's college education in the U.S. When Maria stepped into John Hargrove's penthouse for the first time, she was struck by its coldness. The walls were adorned with minimalist art, the furniture angular and monochrome. It was a palace of wealth, yet it lacked a soul. Determined to change that, Maria approached her work with care. She cleaned every surface until it gleamed, but she also added subtle touches. A vase of fresh flowers on the dining table, neatly arranged books in the living room, and family photos she found tucked away in a drawer placed lovingly on a mantel. Over time, Maria transformed the penthouse into more than a luxurious space. She made it a home. Little did she know, her work would become the foundation for a dramatic collision of two worlds. Maria Alvarez arrived at the penthouse just after sunrise, her modest second-hand bike locked securely to a lamppost downstairs. The doorman, accustomed to wealthy residents and their high-profile guests, barely glanced at her as she entered with her cleaning supplies. "Morning," Maria greeted softly, the hum of her accent lingering in the air. The man offered a curt nod, more focused on his phone than the young woman passing through. The elevator ride to the top floor was smooth and silent. As the doors opened, Maria stepped into John Hargrove's sanctuary, though she didn't know much about him. To her, he was just another wealthy client, and her job was to maintain the pristine image of his home while he lay in a coma miles away. The first thing Maria noticed was the stillness. The sprawling penthouse seemed untouched, as though frozen in time since the day its owner fell ill. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes swirling in the air. "This place feels more like a museum than a home," Maria murmured to herself, setting down her supplies. She pulled on a pair of gloves and set to work. Polishing, dusting, scrubbing. Maria moved with practiced precision, her hands weaving through the space as if guided by an invisible map. Yet, she couldn't help but notice the sterility of the environment. It was as if the apartment was trying to erase any trace of human life. As she cleaned, Maria discovered remnants of the man who once lived there. In a drawer near the kitchen, she found a stack of old photographs. One caught her eye, a younger John, standing proudly beside a woman and a boy, perhaps his family. Their smiles were genuine, unguarded, a stark contrast to the hardened businesslike figure she'd seen in the news articles. Maria hesitated, then gently placed the photo on the fireplace mantel. Over the weeks, Maria grew familiar with the rhythms of the empty penthouse. Every room told a story. She found shelves lined with books on leadership and finance, but also a dusty copy of a poetry anthology. There were no pets, no personal trinkets, no evidence of hobbies or indulgences. Maria began to add her touch. She left small arrangements of fresh flowers from the market, simple daisies, sunflowers, or carnations that brought a burst of color to the muted tones of the apartment. She dusted off the hidden photo frames and arranged them on side tables. She even brought a cheap but cheerful rug to cover the cold marble flooring in the sitting room. "Even billionaires deserve warmth," she joked to herself, fluffing the cushions she'd cleaned. Her transformation of the space was more than aesthetic. It was deeply personal. It reminded her of the home she had left behind in Mexico, where love and laughter filled every corner despite the modest surroundings. Maria's dedication to her work was not just about earning a paycheck. It was about creating something meaningful. It was for her sister, for her family, and for the life she was determined to build in this foreign land. What Maria didn't know was that her efforts were being noticed. "Miss Alvarez has done a remarkable job," commented Mrs. Peterson, the property manager, during her monthly visit. She ran a gloved hand over the spotless banister and eyed the room with approval. "It's as if the place has woken up, even with Mr. Hargrove gone." "I agree," chimed in Roger, the concierge, who handled deliveries and occasional errands for the building's residents. "She's different. There's heart in what she does. You don't see that often." Maria, oblivious to these comments, continued her work with quiet dignity. At night, Maria returned to her small apartment in Queens, where her younger sister, Sophia, often waited for her with questions about homework or stories from school. "How was the big house today?" Sophia asked one evening, sitting cross-legged on the worn couch. "It's beautiful," Maria replied, a hint of wonder in her voice. "But it's empty, like a shell waiting for someone to live in it again." Sophia leaned forward. "Do you think the owner will wake up?" Maria hesitated, not wanting to give false hope. "Maybe," she said softly. "Sometimes people find their way back, even when it seems impossible." Though Maria wouldn't admit it, she had begun to feel a strange connection to John Hargrove, the man she had never met. In organizing his home, she was piecing together fragments of his life, imagining the kind of person he might have been before his world stopped. As the months passed, the penthouse became a reflection of Maria's spirit, warm, welcoming, and alive. But even as she settled into her routine, she was unaware of the storm brewing. One day, everything would change. One day, John Hargrove would wake up. And when he did, the first thing he'd see was Maria. The beep of the heart monitor was rhythmic, steady, and unchanging. For nearly 2 years, John Hargrove's existence had been reduced to the sound of machines, the soft shuffle of nurses, and the occasional murmurs of visitors he couldn't hear. His once dominant presence was now confined to a hospital bed, his muscles atrophied, and his world darkened by an unbroken silence. Until today, John's fingers twitched. The movement was so slight that the attending nurse might have missed it if she hadn't been adjusting his foreline at the time. Her sharp intake of breath was followed by a flurry of activity. "Doctor, we've got movement." Within hours, John's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. The room was stark and white, a sensory assault after years of darkness. Slowly, the realization dawned: he was alive. His throat burned as he tried to speak, his voice a faint rasp. "Where am I?" "Mr. Hargrove, you're in Mount Sinai Hospital," the doctor explained gently. "You've been in a coma for 2 years following a cardiac event. It's going to take time to recover, but it's good to see you awake." 2 years. The words echoed in John's mind, incomprehensible. His empire, his life, the deal he had fought so hard to secure. Where was it now? He tried to sit up, but his body felt like lead. The weight of his absence pressed down on him harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. After weeks of physical therapy and monitored recovery, John was discharged. The ride to his Manhattan penthouse was eerily quiet. His personal driver, an older man who had worked for him for years, seemed hesitant to speak, unsure of how to interact with the man who had been a ghost for so long. When they arrived, John stepped out of the car, leaning heavily on a cane. He stared up at the towering building where he had built his life, the pinnacle of his success, now alien and unfamiliar. The doorman greeted him with a polite, "Welcome home, Mr. Hargrove." John nodded but said nothing, his mind racing. As the elevator ascended, he braced himself for the inevitable chaos his absence must have wrought. The elevator doors opened, and John stepped into his penthouse. It was both familiar and different. The space still bore the hallmarks of his design: modern furniture, expansive views. But there was something new, something unexpected. The air smelled faintly of lavender and fresh linen. A vibrant vase of sunflowers sat on the coffee table. A woven rug, warm and colorful, softened the cold marble floors. And then he saw her. Maria Alvarez stood in the living room, a spray bottle in one hand and a cleaning rag in the other. She wore simple jeans and a t-shirt, her hair tied back in a loose braid. She was dusting the edge of the fireplace mantel when she heard the sound of his cane tapping against the floor. Maria turned, startled, and froze when she saw him. "Oh," she exclaimed, her accent wrapping around the word. You're awake." John's eyes narrowed as he assessed her. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough but commanding. "I'm Maria," she replied hesitantly, her grip tightening on the rag. "I was hired to take care of your home while you were gone." John's eyes swept the room, taking in the subtle changes. "Gone," he echoed, his tone edged with suspicion. "This is my home. I don't recall authorizing anyone to touch my things, much less." His gaze snapped back to her. "You." Maria straightened, her initial nervousness replaced by quiet dignity. "The property manager hired me, Mr. Hargrove. I've been here for over a year, ensuring your home stayed in order." "I didn't ask for this," he snapped, his frustration bubbling over. "You had no right to change anything. Who told you to move my things?" "I didn't move anything important," Maria said firmly, holding her ground. "I only made it livable." "Livable?" John scoffed, his voice rising. "I didn't need anyone's help to make it livable. And I certainly didn't ask for someone like you to turn my home into." He gestured vaguely, his words failing him. "Whatever this is." Maria flinched at the implied insult, but her chin lifted. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said evenly, though her voice carried a sharp edge. "But I was doing my job." The tension in the room was palpable. John, struggling to process the loss of control over his life, saw Maria as an intruder. Maria, hurt by his disdain, refused to shrink under his scrutiny. "Get out," he finally said, his voice low but resolute. "I'll deal with the property manager myself." Maria hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. Then, with a tight nod, she gathered her things and walked to the door. "Goodbye, Mr. Hargrove," she said quietly, pausing briefly before exiting. The door closed behind her, leaving John alone in the transformed space. Hours later, John paced the penthouse, his cane tapping against the floors. Every detail that Maria had touched seemed to mock him. The sunflowers, the cozy rug, the photographs she had displayed. All of it was a testament to her presence in his absence. For the first time in years, John Hargrove felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't the anger that usually fueled him, or the ambition that defined him. It was loss. The days after Maria's departure or a haze of frustration and confusion for John Hargrove. His penthouse, once a sanctuary of sleek perfection, now felt foreign. Every time he walked past the mantel and saw the photograph of his family, something he hadn't looked at in years, a knot formed in his stomach. At first, he tried to ignore it. He instructed his personal assistant to remove the flowers and have the vibrant rug rolled up and stored away. But no matter how much he tried to strip away the traces of Maria's influence, they lingered in the warmth she had infused into the space. 3 days later, Mrs. Peterson, the property manager, arrived at John's request. Dressed in a tailored blazer and holding a clipboard, she was the picture of professionalism. "Mr. Hargrove," she began, her tone measured, "you requested an explanation about Maria Alvarez. She's the housekeeper we hired when you were hospitalized." "Housekeeper?" John said, his voice sharp. "Is that what you call someone who rearranges a man's life without permission?" Mrs. Peterson shifted uncomfortably, but maintained her composure. "Maria came highly recommended. We wanted someone trustworthy to ensure your home remained cared for in your absence. She went above and beyond her duties, turning this place into what I believe most would call a home." John's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't her job." "Perhaps not," Mrs. Peterson admitted. "But given the circumstances, she took the initiative. And frankly, Mr. Hargrove, I think you should thank her." "Thank her?" John repeated, incredulous. "For overstepping her boundaries." Mrs. Peterson sighed. "Mr. Hargrove, I've known you for years. Your home was impressive, yes, but it lacked life. Maria gave it warmth. If you could look beyond your anger, you might see that." John dismissed her with a wave. "I'll decide what's necessary for my life, Mrs. Peterson. You may leave." Later that evening, John ventured out to the cafe downstairs for the first time since his return. The brisk autumn air bit at his skin as he leaned on his cane and made his way to a quiet table near the window. He ordered a black coffee and sat in silence, watching the city move around him. Then out of the corner of his eye he saw her. Maria was seated at a small table across the cafe, a cup of tea in her hands, and a book open before her. She was unaware of his presence, her focus on the pages in front of her. For a moment John debated leaving. He wasn't ready for another confrontation, especially in public. But something rooted him to his seat. The need to understand the woman who had so thoroughly disrupted his life. He stood, walking with deliberate steps to her table. "Maria," he said, his voice clipped. Startled, she looked up, her wide brown eyes meeting his. "Mr. Hargrove," she replied cautiously, setting her book down. "Do you always make a habit of taking over other people's homes?" he asked, his tone more biting than he intended. Maria's gaze hardened. "And do you always greet people who've helped you with insults?" The sharpness of her response caught John off guard. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Maria. "I didn't ask for your help," he said after a moment. "No," Maria replied, her voice steady, "but you needed it. Whether you want to admit it or not, I kept your home from becoming just another cold, empty space. And I did it with respect, even when you didn't deserve it." John blinked, surprised by her boldness. He searched for a retort but found none. Maria's words struck a nerve, one he wasn't ready to acknowledge. "I'm not here to fight with you," she said, her tone softening. "I'm sorry if I offended you, but I only wanted to make your home feel like someone cared." John stood there, torn between his instinct to assert control and an unfamiliar sense of guilt. Maria's words hung in the air, and for the first time, he realized how ungrateful he must have sounded. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice quieter. "Why go to so much trouble?" Maria hesitated, then said simply, "Because that's who I am. And because I know what it's like to be forgotten." The vulnerability in her words unsettled John. He nodded curtly, unsure of how to respond, and turned to leave. "Good night, Mr. Hargrove," Maria said softly as he walked away. Back in his penthouse, John sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the photograph on the mantel. For years, he had buried his emotions under work, achievements, and control. But now, cracks were forming in the armor he had so carefully constructed. Maria's defiance, her dignity, her quiet strength, they lingered in his mind. Perhaps Mrs. Peterson was right. Perhaps the changes Maria made weren't just to the apartment. They were to him. John Hargrove was an early riser, but the sunrise held no comfort for him. The penthouse, though vast and luxurious, felt stifling in the quiet hours of the morning. Restless, he poured himself a cup of coffee and wandered the space, his cane tapping softly against the marble floors. His gaze fell on the photograph Maria had placed on the mantel. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. The picture was taken years ago, at the height of his success. In it, John stood beside his late wife, Rebecca, and their son Adam, who was no older than 10 at the time. Adam. The name hit him like a wave, dredging up feelings he'd spent years suppressing. Adam, now grown and estranged, hadn't spoken to him since Rebecca's funeral. The boy he once adored had become a stranger. And the truth John had refused to confront was simple. He had driven Adam away. He set the photograph down and exhaled, his chest tight. "Why did she have to bring this out?" he muttered, though his frustration felt hollow. As he moved through the apartment, John couldn't help but notice the subtle changes Maria had made. It was in the details. The way the couch pillows were arranged, the small woven basket holding rolled-up throws near the sofa, and the faint smell of lavender lingering in the air. The dining table now had a simple but elegant centerpiece, a bowl of fresh apples, and a small arrangement of wildflowers. In the study, his books had been meticulously organized by genre and size, with a few classic titles displayed prominently on the desk. The most unexpected discovery was in the kitchen. On the refrigerator, Maria had taped a handwritten note. "Tomorrow can always be better than today. Keep going." John stared at the words, a strange lump forming in his throat. He hadn't noticed the note until now, but its simplicity struck a chord. As the day wore on, John's curiosity grew. He began to look for more of Maria's handiwork, searching his own home, as if seeing it for the first time. In the bedroom, the drawer of his nightstand held another surprise. An envelope labeled "Letters from Rebecca." He had buried these letters years ago, unable to face the words his wife had written during her illness. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding the envelope in his trembling hands. Maria must have found it while cleaning, but instead of discarding it or putting it somewhere out of reach, she had left it here, as if she knew it belonged in his hands. That evening, John opened the envelope and unfolded the first letter. Rebecca's handwriting was graceful, her words unflinchingly honest. "My dearest John, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer by your side. I know how hard it is for you to let people in, to show vulnerability, but I need you to promise me one thing. Don't let your grief isolate you from the world. Don't let it isolate you from Adam. He needs you, John. He always will." Tears welled in his eyes. Rebecca's words were a mirror, reflecting the man he had become. He hadn't just isolated himself. He had built walls so high that even his son couldn't climb them. That night, John couldn't sleep. He found himself pacing the living room, glancing at the photograph on the mantel. Maria's words from their encounter in the cafe echoed in his mind. "I know what it's like to be forgotten." Her statement had been so raw, so quietly powerful. It nagged at him. What had she meant? Maria had turned his sterile penthouse into something that resembled life. It wasn't just her cleaning. It was her intentionality, her thoughtfulness. And now, even in her absence, she had left her mark. The next morning, John stood at the window, staring out at the city he had once commanded. The skyline, a symbol of his ambition, now seemed like a reminder of all he had lost. Gripping his cane, he reached for his phone and hesitated before dialing. The ringing on the other end was brief. "Mrs. Peterson," he said when the call connected. "Could you give me Maria Alvarez's contact information?" There was a pause, and then Mrs. Peterson's cautious voice replied, "May I ask why, Mr. Hargrove?" John sighed. "I need to apologize." That afternoon, Maria was tidying up a modest townhouse in Queens when her phone buzzed. She hesitated before answering the unfamiliar number. "Hello? Maria, this is John Hargrove." She froze at the sound of his voice, her fingers tightening around the phone. "Mr. Hargrove," she said evenly. "What can I do for you?" He faltered and used to admitting fault. "I wanted to say I may have been wrong. About you." Maria was silent for a long moment. "I appreciate that, Mr. Hargrove," she finally said, her tone guarded. "I'd like to meet," he continued. "To talk. If you're willing." Maria exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Against her better judgment, she said, "All right." When? John glanced around his transformed home, the weight of change heavy on his shoulders. "As soon as you're free." The conversation had begun, but neither of them knew how it would unfold. For John, it was a step toward confronting the emptiness in his life. For Maria, it was a chance to stand her ground and show him the humanity he had long ignored. In their meeting, two worlds would collide again, this time with the potential for understanding. The cafe was quiet when Maria arrived, a small bell tinkling as she pushed open the door. She wore a modest dress, her hair tied back in a simple braid, and clutched her bag tightly as she scanned the room. Her eyes landed on John, sitting in a corner booth by the window. John looked different than the man who had dismissed her days ago. His posture was less rigid, and there was a softness in his expression that hadn't been there before. Maria hesitated before walking over, her steps deliberate. "Mr. Hargrove," she said evenly, standing across from him. "Maria," he replied, rising with some effort and motioning for her to sit. "Thank you for coming." They sat in an awkward silence for a moment. Maria stirred her tea while John's coffee grew cold. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice low but steady. "I didn't treat you fairly, and I made assumptions I shouldn't have." Maria looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Thank you," she said simply. He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the table. "You made a lot of changes to my home. At first, I hated it. I felt like I'd lost control of something I'd worked so hard to build." Maria nodded, understanding. "It wasn't my intention to take control. I just wanted to help. Your home felt so empty, like it was waiting for someone to come back to it." Her words hung in the air, and John's jaw tightened. He nodded slightly. "It was. What I don't understand," John said after a moment, "is why you cared. Why go beyond cleaning and make it personal?" Maria hesitated. She hadn't expected to share her story with him, but there was something about his tone, earnest and almost vulnerable, that made her continue. "I came to this country 3 years ago," she began. "I left everything behind, my family, my home, because I had no choice. My sister, Sophia, had a chance to study here, but we didn't have the money to make it happen. So, I came ahead to work and send money back to support her." John listened intently, his usual air of impatience replaced by curiosity. "My first year here was the hardest," Maria continued. "I didn't speak much English, and finding work was humiliating. People saw me as just another immigrant, someone to do the jobs they didn't want. But I took every opportunity one could find, because Sophia's future depended on it." Her voice faltered for a moment, but she pushed on. "When I was hired to care for your home, I saw it as more than just a job. It was a chance to create something beautiful. I needed that, Mr. Hargrove. I needed to remind myself that I wasn't invisible, that I could make a difference, even in small ways." John was quiet, processing her words. He had spent so much of his life focused on wealth and control that the idea of someone working so hard for another's future was foreign to him. "You sacrificed everything for your sister," he said finally. "That's admirable." Maria shrugged. "It's just what family does. Sophia has a chance to make something of her life, and that's all that matters." Her humility struck John. He thought of his own estranged son, Adam, and the rift between them. Maria's devotion to her sister was a sharp contrast to his own failure as a father. "I didn't expect to hear that," John admitted. "I've spent most of my life believing that success comes from looking out for yourself. But listening to you," he paused, struggling to find the words. "It's clear that I've been blind to a lot of things." Maria tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe it's not too late to see them now." John let out a soft, humorless laugh. "I don't even know where to start." "Start by listening," Maria said gently. "To yourself. To the people around you. You'd be surprised how much you can learn if you stop trying to control everything." Her words, though simple, carried a weight that John couldn't ignore. After an hour, their conversation wound down. John paid the bill and stood, leaning on his cane. "Maria," he said as she gathered her things, "thank you for coming here today, and for everything you did in my home." Maria smiled faintly. "You're welcome, Mr. Hargrove." As she turned to leave, John called after her. "Wait, would you consider coming back? She hesitated, looking at him carefully. Why? Because, John said slowly, I think I could learn something from you. Maria agreed to think about it, and as she left the cafe, John felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maria's story had planted a seed of change in him, challenging his long-held beliefs about success and worth. For the first time, he saw his wealth not as a fortress, but as a tool, one that could be used to build something greater than himself. And as he walked back to his penthouse, the memory of her words lingered. Maybe it's not too late. The silence of the penthouse was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. John Hargrove sat in his study, staring at the empty notepad in front of him. His conversation with Maria replayed in his mind like a haunting melody. Her words had struck a chord he couldn't ignore. Start by listening. To yourself. To the people around you. John sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He opened the drawer of his desk and retrieved the letters from Rebecca he'd found days earlier. He hesitated, then unfolded another one, letting her familiar handwriting guide him through memories he had buried. John, I hope you're reading this on a quiet night, when the city feels still. I know how hard it is for you to slow down. You always told me that resting is for people without ambition. But I always wished you could see that the greatest ambition isn't just building an empire. It's building connections that matter. If you're reading this, please reach out to Adam. He's stubborn just like you, but he needs his father. And John, I think you need him too. The letter ended with a simple postscript. It's never too late to choose love. John placed the letter down carefully, his hands trembling. Adam, his estranged son, had been a specter in his life for years, a reminder of his failures as a father. The next morning, after pacing the penthouse for what felt like hours, John picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Adam's name. His thumb hovered over the call button for several seconds before he pressed it. The phone rang, each tone amplifying his anxiety. Finally, a voice answered. Hello, Adam. It's your father, John said, his voice unusually tentative. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I didn't think I'd hear from you, Adam said finally, his tone guarded. I didn't think I'd have the courage to call, John admitted. But I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. About you. About us. Adam's sigh crackled through the line. What do you want, Dad? I want to talk, John said. No business. No arguments. Just talk. Adam hesitated, then relented. All right. Let's meet. Later that week, John found himself standing outside a modest brick building in Queens. Maria had agreed to meet him here, and he felt strangely out of place. Gone were the towering skyscrapers and luxury vehicles. This neighborhood bustled with life, children playing on the sidewalks and families chatting on stoops. Maria emerged from the building, carrying a canvas bag of groceries. She spotted John and gave him a small nod. You found it. Barely, John said, glancing around. This isn't exactly my usual stomping ground. Maria smirked. That's the point, Mr. Hargrove. Change doesn't happen in familiar places. Maria led him up the narrow stairwell to her apartment, where her younger sister Sophia greeted them at the door. Mr. Hargrove, this is Sophia, Maria said, her tone softening as she introduced her sister. Sophia extended her hand, her smile bright and welcoming. Nice to meet you, Mr. Hargrove. Maria's told me about you. John shook her hand, feeling uncharacteristically nervous under the teenager's curious gaze. All good things, I hope. She says you're learning, Sophia replied cheekily, earning a laugh from Maria. Inside, the apartment was small but cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and colorful decorations. The air smelled of freshly cooked tortillas, and a gentle hum of music played in the background. John took it all in, feeling both out of place and strangely comforted. Over dinner, John listened as Maria and Sophia spoke about their lives. Maria's sacrifices and Sophia's dreams of becoming a doctor painted a picture of resilience and hope that John found both humbling and inspiring. You remind me of someone, John said suddenly, addressing Maria. Who? She asked. My wife, Rebecca, John said. She had a way of making me see things I didn't want to see. And like you, she wasn't afraid to tell me when I was wrong. Maria smiled faintly. She sounds like someone worth listening to. She was, John said, his voice thick with emotion. That night, As John left the apartment and returned to his penthouse, he felt lighter. The visit had stirred something in him, a desire to rebuild not just his home, but his life. Maria's words echoed in his mind. Change doesn't happen in familiar places. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began drafting an email to his board of directors. The subject line was simple: a new direction. John had decided to channel his wealth and influence into something meaningful. The first step would be funding scholarships for immigrant families, starting with Maria's sister Sophia. As he typed, a small smile played on his lips. For the first time in years, John felt like he was building something worth having. Not an empire, but a legacy. The next morning, John Hargrove stood on the balcony of his penthouse, gazing out at the New York skyline. For years, this view had symbolized his power and success. Now it felt like a challenge, a reminder that he had the means to make a difference, but not without risk. The email he had sent to his board of directors had triggered an emergency meeting. His intention to pivot the company's focus toward philanthropic initiatives, particularly funding educational programs for immigrants, had been met with mixed reactions. The boardroom was eerily similar to the one where John had collapsed 2 years ago. The same cold marble table, the same towering windows overlooking the city. But this time, John wasn't here to dominate the conversation. He was here to defend his vision. "John, let me get this straight," began Charles Bennett, a senior board member with a permanent scowl etched into his face. "You want to redirect millions of dollars from our most profitable ventures to fund scholarships and housing projects for immigrants?" "That's exactly what I'm proposing," John said, his tone firm but calm. Another member, a woman named Eleanor Crane, leaned forward. "John, while it's admirable, this isn't why investors trust us with their money. Our priority is to maximize returns." John tapped his fingers against the table, his mind racing. "And what if we can do both? Imagine the reputation boost for our company if we lead the charge in social responsibility. This isn't just charity, it's investment in the future." "But it's not your future, John," Charles countered. "You're gambling with the livelihoods of everyone who works here." John's eyes narrowed. "And what good is all this success if we can't use it to make a real difference? If we can't leave the world better than we found it?" The room fell silent. John had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated how deeply entrenched the opposition would be. That evening, John found himself dialing Maria's number. When she answered, her voice was a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." "I need your advice," John admitted, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "From me?" Maria sounded amused but intrigued. "What's the problem?" John explained the board's resistance to his plan, his frustration evident in his tone. "They don't see the value in helping others. They only care about profits." Maria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Change takes time, Mr. Hargrove. And it starts small. Maybe instead of fighting them all at once, you show them what's possible. Prove that your idea works." Her words struck a chord. John nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Start small," he repeated. The next day, John proposed a pilot program during a follow-up meeting with the board. Instead of redirecting a significant portion of the company's funds, he suggested starting with a modest investment, a scholarship program for young immigrants. "If the program fails," John said, addressing the skeptical faces around the table, "I'll take full responsibility. But if it succeeds, we'll have proof that doing good can also be good for business." Reluctantly, the board approved the pilot program, though Charles muttered under his breath, "This better not blow up in our faces." The announcement of the scholarship program was met with immediate interest from local immigrant communities. John insisted on being part of the selection process, reviewing applications with a team of advisors. When Maria's sister, Sophia, applied, John felt a surge of pride. Her essay was heartfelt and ambitious, detailing her dream of becoming a doctor to serve underserved communities. At the program's launch event, John personally handed Sophia her scholarship certificate. She beamed with gratitude, tears in her eyes as Maria stood nearby, clapping with quiet pride. "You're going to do great things," John told Sophia as cameras flashed. "Only because people like you and Maria believe in me," Sophia replied. Not everyone shared Sophia's optimism. Within weeks, whispers of dissent began circulating among John's former allies. Business columns criticized him for abandoning his corporate instincts, and a few investors quietly sold their shares, signaling their lack of confidence. Charles Bennett confronted John in his office. "Do you see what's happening? You're jeopardizing everything we've built." "No," John replied, his voice steady. "I'm building something better." "You're alienating your partners, John," Charles pressed. "You'll lose their trust." "Then I'll find new partners," John said firmly. To John's surprise, Eleanor Crane approached him after a particularly tense meeting. "You're not wrong, John," she said, her voice quiet but earnest. "It's just people like us aren't used to thinking this way. But I admire what you're trying to do." John raised an eyebrow. "So, does that mean you're on board?" Cautiously, Eleanor replied with a small smile. "But yes, I am." As the scholarship program gained traction, John's determination only grew. The positive press surrounding Sophia and the other recipients began to shift public opinion. Articles praised John for his bold leadership, and even some of his harshest critics began to reconsider. For the first time in years, John felt like he was creating something meaningful, not just for himself but for the world. That night, John stood by the mantel in his living room, staring at the family photo Maria had placed there. He thought of Rebecca's letters, of Maria's unwavering strength, and of Sophia's boundless potential. Maria was right. Change didn't happen in familiar places. It started in the uncomfortable spaces, the places where growth was possible. He picked up the photo and smiled faintly. "We're just getting started," he murmured. The boardroom was packed. Every member was present, their expressions ranging from thinly veiled irritation to outright skepticism. The tension in the air was palpable as Charles Bennett, the loudest voice of dissent, leaned back in his chair with a smug smile. "John, your little experiment is turning into a public spectacle," Charles said, flipping through a stack of papers. "Some of our top investors are concerned. They don't care about scholarships or social projects. They care about returns." John leaned on his cane, his eyes calm but resolute. "And what about the returns we've already seen? Increased press coverage, positive brand perception, increased employee engagement. The numbers don't lie, Charles." Charles waved him off. "Those are intangibles. We're in the business of tangible results, money. And this distraction of yours is scaring off the people who matter." "I disagree." The room turned to Eleanor Crane, who rarely spoke in these heated exchanges. She adjusted her glasses and continued. "The people who matter are the ones buying into what we stand for. If we alienate them now, we're not just losing investors, we're losing the future." John gave her a small, grateful nod. Despite Eleanor's support, the opposition within the boardroom grew louder. Charles began rallying others to his side, pushing for a vote to scale back the scholarship program and shift focus back to more traditional business strategies. "We've humored you long enough, John," Charles said during a heated exchange. "Either you rein this in, or we'll have to consider other leadership options." The veiled threat hung in the air, but John didn't flinch. "Do what you have to do," he said firmly. "But I'll remind you all, this company didn't succeed because we played it safe. We succeeded because we dared to be bold. And if boldness scares you, maybe I'm not the one who's out of place here." The room erupted into murmurs as John gathered his papers and left the meeting, leaving Charles fuming. That evening, John called Maria. "I think I've just handed Charles Bennett the keys to my career," he said bitterly. "Why? What happened?" Maria asked. John explained the day's events, his frustration spilling out. "I'm trying to do something good, something meaningful, but these people, they only care about protecting their comfort." Maria's voice was steady as she replied, "You're doing the right thing, Mr. Hargrove. Change is always uncomfortable, especially for those who benefit from the way things are. But you've already started something. Don't let fear stop you now." Her words, as always, grounded him. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Employees from across Hargrove Enterprises began voicing their support for John's initiatives. Stories of the scholarship recipients circulated internally, sparking a sense of pride within the company. Even some of the younger board members, inspired by the positive momentum, began to speak up during meetings. Charles, however, wasn't done fighting. The tension reached its peak at an annual investor summit, where John was scheduled to deliver a keynote address. Charles had planned to use the event to publicly undermine him, but John had other ideas. When he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Dressed in his usual tailored suit, with his cane in hand, John looked every bit the formidable leader he had always been. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "Hargrove Enterprises has always been about success. But success isn't just about what we achieve for ourselves. It's about what we contribute to the world." He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him lit up with photos of scholarship recipients, including Sophia. "These young men and women represent the future," John continued. "By investing in them, we're not just doing good, we're creating a stronger, more sustainable foundation for our company and our society." He paused, letting the images sink in. "I know some of you are hesitant," he said, looking directly at Charles. "Change is difficult, but I didn't build this company by being afraid of difficult decisions. I built it by believing in what's possible." The room broke into applause, and John saw a few heads nodding, even among those who had been skeptical. Backstage, Charles confronted John one final time. "You might have won them over for now," Charles said through gritted teeth, "but this isn't over." John met his gaze with quiet determination. "It is for you, Charles. Your time in this company is done." "What are you talking about?" Charles demanded. "I've already spoken to the rest of the board," John said. "Your refusal to adapt isn't just holding us back. It's threatening everything we're trying to build. The vote to remove you is scheduled for tomorrow." Charles's face reddened with anger, but he said nothing. He stormed out, leaving John standing tall. The next morning, the board voted overwhelmingly to remove Charles. The decision marked a turning point for Hargrove Enterprises, solidifying its commitment to John's vision of blending profitability with purpose. That evening, John stood in his living room, staring at the skyline. Maria's advice had carried him through the storm, and Rebecca's words reminded him of what truly mattered. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The scholarship program expanded, and new initiatives followed. Affordable housing projects, mentorship programs, and partnerships with local communities. Maria, now a close advisor and friend to John, played a key role in shaping these projects, her insight and compassion guiding every step. As the company flourished under this new model, John began to see the results not just in the business, but in his own life. The bridges he had burned were slowly being rebuilt, starting with his relationship with Adam. And as he sat in his transformed penthouse, surrounded by the warmth Maria had introduced, he realized that for the first time, he was truly living. The room was alive with energy. Guests filled the newly renovated community center, its walls adorned with photos of scholarship recipients and their achievements. A banner stretched across the main hall read, "Building Futures Together, Hargrove Foundation Launch Celebration." John Hargrove stood at the center of it all, surrounded by a crowd that included employees, community leaders, and beneficiaries of his new initiatives. The foundation was the culmination of months of tireless effort, a formal entity to channel the company's wealth into education, housing, and community development projects. Maria Alvarez stood nearby, her sister Sophia at her side. Sophia was glowing with pride, her scholarship certificate framed and displayed at one of the event tables. When the time came, John took the stage, the room falling silent as he approached the microphone. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but carrying a hint of emotion. "It's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time. A little over a year ago, I woke up to find that my life, and my home, had transformed in ways I couldn't understand. At first I resisted. I thought I was losing control. But the truth is, I was gaining something far more important." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "I've spent most of my life chasing success, believing it could fill the void left by loss and failure. But I've learned that real success isn't measured in profits or accolades. It's measured in the lives we touch and the legacies we leave behind." The audience erupted in applause. John continued, "I owe much of this transformation to the people who reminded me of what truly matters. To Maria Alvarez, whose compassion and strength inspired me to see beyond myself. To my late wife Rebecca, whose words still guide me. And to all of you, who have joined me on this journey to build a better future. After his speech, John found Maria near the refreshments table. She was speaking to Sophia, her face lit with pride. When she noticed John, she excused herself and approached him. "That was a great speech," she said with a smile. "I meant every word," John replied. "And I meant what I said about you. None of this would have happened without your influence." Maria tilted her head, her expression softening. "You give me too much credit, Mr. Hargrove. You were the one who made the choice to change." He shook his head. "Change doesn't happen in isolation. It starts with people like you. People who show us what we've been too blind to see." Maria's smile widened, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said quietly. Later that evening, as the event began to wind down, John noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd. His heart caught in his chest as he recognized Adam. Father and son exchanged a long look before Adam stepped forward. "Adam," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad," Adam replied, his tone tentative but open. The two stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Adam extended his hand. John hesitated before pulling him into a hug. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the healing that had begun. As the celebration continued, Maria found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Community leaders thanked her for her role in shaping the foundation's projects. And Sophia beamed with pride as people congratulated her on her scholarship. For Maria, the night was a validation of every sacrifice she had made. She had come to this country with nothing but determination, and now, she was a key part of something much bigger than herself. In the months that followed, the Hargrove Foundation expanded its reach, partnering with organizations across the country to create educational and housing opportunities for underserved communities. John continued to work closely with Maria, who became a trusted advisor and a friend. Together, they ensured that the foundation stayed true to its mission, driven by the values Maria had taught him. Back in his penthouse one evening, John stood by the fireplace, staring at the family photo Maria had placed there long ago. But now, it was surrounded by new pictures. Sophia at her scholarship ceremony, Adam at the foundation's launch, and a group photo of the Hargrove team with the first class of scholarship recipients. The once cold space was now alive with memories, warmth, and purpose, a reflection of the man John had become. As John sat down to write a letter, his first in years, he addressed it to Maria. "Dear Maria, I've learned that life has a way of giving us second chances when we least expect them. You were mine. You reminded me of the power of compassion, of the strength that comes from helping others. Because of you, I found not just success but purpose. And for that, I will always be grateful. Thank you, John." He placed the letter on his desk, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, John felt whole. A new chapter begins. The Hargrove Foundation became a beacon of hope, transforming countless lives. And for John, Maria, Sophia, and everyone touched by their work, it was a testament to the power of change, the courage to embrace it, and the humanity that binds us all.